Thank you very much, Lam, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come here today to what I think is an extremely important and significant conference. I'm very happy to bring you here the greetings from social workers in the United Kingdom, and especially from the Social Work Action Network. And I think we're all very excited that this conference is happening here today in Hong Kong. I understand there are colleagues here from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and also from mainland China, and I particularly want to greet the colleagues from mainland China. It's unfortunate that some delegates have not been able to come, but I'm very pleased that others have. Just a little bit about myself. I come from Scotland, and when I say I come from Scotland, I don't know how much you know about Scotland, but when I mention Scotland, people say that this is a country where men wear skirts. I'm not wearing a skirt or a kilt today, but I thought I should perhaps share with you. Sometimes I wear a kilt, but only at weddings. Only at weddings. This was my son's wedding a couple of years ago. Normally we do not wear kilts. What I would like to do today in the 30 or 40 minutes that I have is really quite a lot. I want to begin by saying just a little bit about the context of social work today. It's quite challenging because clearly the context is not the same everywhere, but maybe just to identify some of the key features of the context. I want to look a little bit about the state of social work in Europe and the UK, but also I was speaking to some of the Chinese colleagues yesterday, and I know the situation, particularly in mainland China, is different, so I want to say just a few words about that. Can social work survive? That may seem a dramatic question, but what I mean is can progressive social work and social work based on a model of social justice survive, whether in the East or in the West? I want to briefly look at the history of social work and to suggest, and if you take only one thing out of my paper today, I would like you to take this out, that social work has always been a contested profession. There have always been different traditions within social work. And I want to look today and argue in favour particularly of the radical social work tradition. So I want to look at what we mean by that, and I want to suggest that in recent years, and I think today is an example of this, in recent years we have seen the growth of what is still quite a new movement, but it's a movement that is saying that social work is not just about controlling people's lives, that social work is not just about social stability, but that social work is about social justice, and that social work is about social change, and that the forms of social work that dominate today, particularly both in the West, I think, but also in the East, are really a very, very narrow, reduced version of what we all know social work can be. Social work is capable of making a much greater contribution than it currently does. So that's what I want to say, and I want to look at the new radicalism and suggest some ways forward. So to begin by looking at the big picture, the overall context of social work, I think the overarching characteristic of social work and social welfare today and the world that we live in is what one economist, Michael Roberts, has called the long depression. In other words, the global crisis that emerged in 2008, beginning in the housing market in the US, but which since then has become what the governor of the Bank of England has called the worst crisis in the history of capitalism. It's a crisis which has impacted in different ways in different countries, perhaps less so in China for particular reasons than in the West, but nevertheless I would argue this is a global crisis which is continuing. It's a crisis that began in the banking system, but somehow in a very interesting shift it has now been portrayed as a crisis of welfare for which the poor must pay. So instead of bankers paying for the crisis, we see, particularly in Europe, in the Eurozone, we see the poor, the disabled, people on benefits, paying for a crisis which they did not create. We also see a new level of what we call demonization or stigmatization of poor people as lazy, as not wishing to work, which has led to a rise in what we call hate crime, attacks on people with disabilities. We also see across the world, I think, a growth in racism, fascism and xenophobia. It is at its most extreme in countries like Greece and Hungary, where we see the rise of organisations, of Nazi organisations like Golden Dawn, which we have not seen since the 1930s, since the Hitler period. In France, we see the slightly more respectable fascism of the Front National, while in Britain we have movements such as the United Kingdom independence movement. So we see, as we always see in periods of crisis, the scapegoating of minorities. In the 1930s, it was the Jews. Now in Britain and Europe, it is Muslims and the Roma who are being blamed again for a crisis they did not create. Alongside this, despite the poverty, the growing poverty, we also see, again in Britain, but also globally, including China, we see the rich becoming richer. And in Britain last month, the Sunday Times newspaper published a report which showed that the richest 1,000 people in Britain, the richest 1,000, have more than, the number of billionaires has more than doubled in the past 10 years. So the rich are becoming richer. And this is not, as I say, a British phenomenon. Globally, the richest 1% will own more than all the rest of the world. The 99%, as the Occupy movement said, by 2016. So we see a world which is increasingly divided. That's the bad side. That's the negative side. What we also see, and I'll talk about this later, is the growth of resistance to austerity, to privatisation, and also for more democracy, as we have seen recently here in Hong Kong in the Umbrella movement. So that's the big picture that I want to paint today. This is the world in which we try to practice social work, in which we try to address social problems. Again, just to give briefly, to look at the situation in Britain, in my own country, we now have more than 1,000 food banks across the UK. Food poverty, in one of the richest countries in the world, food poverty has become one of the major issues. More than 1 million people now use food banks due to cuts to welfare benefits, due to increasingly punitive measures against people who are regarded as not looking for work, so they have all their benefits removed. And we see wage cuts. Even the biggest group in poverty in the UK are the working poor. The working poor, because wages have fallen so low. So it's not just people on benefits who are affected, but also those who are working. And more generally, we see in Britain and across Europe the biggest attack on the welfare state, the post-war welfare state we have ever experienced. And the new government that was elected last month in Britain is making cuts which will take welfare spending back to the levels of the 1930s. So we're seeing a fairly massive assault on the whole idea of the welfare state. In Greece, where austerity has been hardest, this is from a Greek colleague who spoke recently at the Social Work Action Network conference in Britain. Poverty in Greece, poverty levels, official poverty levels have now reached 30%. Youth unemployment is up to 55%. Not surprisingly, perhaps, we have seen a huge rise in the number of suicides. In Greece, 3 million people lack access to health care. There has been an increase in mental disorders and HIV rates because of the cutbacks in services, growth of number of children in poverty, increased levels of homelessness, and the biggest gap between the rich and poor in Europe. So it's a fairly bleak picture across Europe. So what does this mean for people who are seeking to practice social work? What does this mean for social workers today? And recent reports show that the social workers now complain that their caseloads have become dangerously high, to the extent that they are putting the lives of children at risk. We see the domination of social work by IT systems. And one very important study 2 or 3 years ago found that due to the managerialism that now prevails, social workers, children and family social workers will spend 80% of each day in front of a computer completing reports, not working with clients, but actually completing assessments. Maybe it's the same here, I'll find out. There are less and less opportunities for working with people, for working with clients, for doing proper social work. The emphasis increasingly is not about meeting people's needs, but simply about managing risk, simply about managing so-called difficult people, difficult behaviours, without looking at why people experience problems in their lives. We have seen the loss of community social work approaches. Social workers in the UK increasingly work in very large call centres, which are very far removed from the areas in which they work. They're cut off from the clients. I see some people nodding, maybe this is happening here too. But it's a separation of people from their clients. We see a lack of preventative social work. We see a lack of social work that could stop problems arising in the first place. As I say, it's much more simply about managing risk. We see what we call higher eligibility criteria. In other words, it's increasingly difficult in some areas of the country, unless your condition is what is called critical. In other words, if there's a risk of death or serious injury, you will not be entitled to a social work service. So we see people, and of course it's normally women in the families, expected to do the work of care for older people or vulnerable people. So once again, it's back to the family to look after people. Charges which were previously free are now costed, so people have to pay for services. And finally, we see a policy called personalisation, which on paper sounds very progressive. It means giving individual budgets to service users to buy as they want, sometimes called cash for care. In reality, it means giving people very small sums of money and then saying, now you're on your own, get on with it. Don't rely on the state anymore. And a very similar picture in the rest of Europe. In Greece, Portugal, Spain, spending cuts, increased workloads initially, the return of food banks. And as the Greek Association of Social Workers said recently, in a country where the welfare state is already in existence, The government simply decided that social work is now a luxury. Okay, so clearly very, very challenging times for social work. And really what I want to focus on in the second half of my talk is how we can respond to this. I just want to say a little bit briefly about China, because clearly there are differences. I had a very interesting discussion yesterday with some of our colleagues from mainland China, and clearly on the surface things look different. In contrast to Europe, we know that there has been a very significant growth of social work in China. China, for reasons we can look at, has been less affected by the global crisis. But nevertheless, we know that the privatization of the formerly state-owned enterprises has led to growing income inequality. The rate of inequality, of growth of inequality in China, the Gini coefficient has been very, very high in recent years, so massive income inequality. And as a result, we see social tensions, partly arising from rural migrants moving into the cities and so on. We see a fear on the part of the government of social conflict and instability. We see a loss of benefits which were previously provided by the state-owned industries. And as a report in this week's Financial Times showed, that is reflected in a growing number of strikes right across the whole of China. And really in response to that, as you're probably aware, in 2006, at the 16th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, a decision was made to prioritise social work and to increase the quantity. So there are now, China, as I'm sure you're aware, is now one of the, after the US, mainland China is now the biggest provider of social work programs anywhere in the world, with 3 million social workers required by 2020. So at one level that sounds positive, but what's important is we look at what kind of social work we are trying to develop. And one study, one account of Chinese social work says a widely agreed definition of what social work is in China and what social workers do is missing. So it really begins to raise the question that I really want to explore today. What do we mean by social work? What kind of social work do we wish to develop? And here I think it's helpful if we look at the definition of social work that was agreed by the International Association Conference last year. And that new definition, the new revised definition of social work says, and I'll read this out, social work is a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes social change and development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and liberation of people. Principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, and respect for diversity are central to social work. So, what we can say about that is quite clearly from that global definition, which if you like is now the official definition of social work. Social work is not just about promoting social cohesion, although certainly building strong communities is part of social work, but at heart, social work is precisely about promoting social change, it's about social justice, and it's about human rights. It's a profession that is underpinned by values of empowerment, by increasing people's rights. And I also what it also suggests is that social work deals with upstream problems, but also downstream problems. In other words, social work needs to be preventative as well as responding to problems. And just to give a little example of what I mean by that, and this may be, I apologise if people already are familiar with this story, but this is one we used in our books, where a man is walking beside a river and he sees someone drowning. So, like many of us, I guess, he jumps in, he pulls the person out, and he begins artificial respiration. While he's doing that, he sees a second person floating by, and what's going on here? So he jumps in again and saves the second person. But this time a crowd has started to gather. As he's doing this, he sees a third person floating down the river. This time the man walks away. The crowd cries after him, "Where are you going? Why don't you save too?" And the man says, "I'm going upstream to find who's pushing them in. Who's pushing these people into the river." So in other words, it's not enough that we simply respond to the immediate problems, but we also have to look at the causes of the problems. What is going on? How do we look at the reasons that people are having problems in the first place? And the reality is that social work has not always done that. As the British academic Bill Jordan has argued, social work has played various roles in contrasting systems of social provision and has served a number of political ends. Its great virtue, that it is almost infinitely adaptable to circumstances, also makes it open to exploitation for any kind of policy objectives. So in other words, at some times and in some countries, social work has been on the side of the poor, has been on the side of the oppressed, has helped make people's lives better. In other countries, most notably during the Nazi period in Germany's, social workers unfortunately ignored the bigger picture and simply carried on with assessing people with mental health problems, with learning disabilities, many of whom would end up either being sterilised or in concentration camps. Social workers pretended that this bigger context did not exist. So there are what I want to suggest to you, therefore, is that there are different forms of social work, some of which are very empowering, some of which historically are not empowering. And I want to suggest, following the academic James Midgley, that historically we can say there have been primarily three main traditions within social work. The first of these traditions, the most common tradition, is what's usually called the remedial tradition of social work. And essentially this is dealing with the problems of individuals without looking at the bigger picture. Now sometimes this kind of, for example, individual casework can be very helpful, can be very important. Social workers in Britain today complain they do not have time to do individual work with clients, to spend time with clients. But it's also a limited form of practice because it does not address the issues, the bigger issues. Why is it that so many of the people who need social work help are poor or are victims of oppression? So it leaves the causes of their problems untouched. The second tradition that Midgley talks about is the development tradition. I should say I myself come from a community development background, and again, one of the biggest complaints of social workers in Britain is we want to see more community development. We want more opportunities to practice community development. And community development and community action have often been important elements of the social work tradition. There is also another side to the development tradition, which we sometimes see, which is where people are told you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that communities have to improve themselves. For example, in the UK, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, talks about the big society, the big society. It sounds like a nice idea, but in practice it means that while they are cutting state-provided services, they expect that communities should look after themselves, often very poor communities. The third tradition, and it's the one I mainly want to talk about now, is the activist or radical tradition, which has always been a minority tradition, but I think it's one that we need to focus on in social work today. I want to suggest to you that this is a tradition which has often been hidden from history, but goes back to the earliest days of social work. This is from a study of social work in the USA in the early part of the 20th century, before the First World War. And the writers of this study say, in hindsight, very few radical social workers in the decade before World War I, very few had consciously revolutionary goals in their daily work. These were not revolutionary social workers. 100 years later, their achievements seem far more reformist than radical. Yet their emphasis on social justice, their analysis of socio-economic conditions in structural or systemic terms, their focus on issues of social class, their links to movements organised by feminists and African Americans, and their ties to radical trade unionists and left-wing political parties represented a threat to the established political order that contemporaries could not ignore. Probably like me, you always think of American social work as being very narrow, very individualistic, very clinical social work. As this book shows, there is a very different tradition in American social work, which is a much more radical tradition and a much more progressive tradition. And similarly, right back in the very, very earliest social work organisations like the Charity Organisation Society in Britain, which was a very punitive society. Their language often sounds like the neoliberals of today. People were deserving or undeserving. People should stand on their own feet. Yet even within that organisation, there were people who said, if I was poor, I would behave in the same way. I would behave like these other people do too. If I was poor, I would also have these problems. So even within these early organisations, we see a different perspective that sees that the problem lies not with the individual, but with poverty and inequality. The settlement movement, again, a movement which developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, a very important part of our social work tradition, but was adopting what was essentially a community development approach, and particularly in the US, in places like Chicago, had very close links to women's groups, to trade unionists, and to the poor and the oppressed. So this is also very much part of our tradition. In Britain, a man called Clement Attlee, who in 1945 became the Prime Minister in Britain, but in 1920 argued, this is his words, that social workers should be, he said, agitators. In other words, because social workers were in daily contact with the poorest people, could see the impact of government policies, social workers had a duty, had a responsibility to speak truth to power, to say these are the problems that people are experiencing, this is the effect your policies are having. Again in the 1930s, a similar movement by a social work academic, Bertha Reynolds, organising social workers to support community struggles and trade union struggles. And then in the 1970s, the emergence across Britain, Canada, Australia, of what we call radical social work. And I'll just say briefly what we meant by that. This was a new movement that developed in the 1970s, as I say, in much of Western Europe. Very briefly, its emphasis was not on individual feelings, its emphasis was not on blaming people for their own problems, but on recognising that these problems were the result of structural inequality and poverty. The welfare state social work was seen as not always helpful, but often controlling and oppressive. They argued for a different relationship between workers and clients. The workers and clients had much in common and should work together. They emphasised the importance of collective community work approaches. They argued for alliances between social workers and collectives of mental health service users, people with disabilities and so on. And they argued that social workers are workers too, and that therefore social workers also need to be to protect their conditions. In order to do good social work, workers need good conditions, and therefore many at this period joined trade unions. So to give a definition of this, in their book Radical Social Work, Bailey and Brake argued radical social work, we feel, is essentially understanding the position of the oppressed in the context of the social and economic structures they live in. Okay? So we're not seeing people in isolation, we're seeing them within the context of these wider structures. This was a very influential movement in much of Britain, Australia, Canada during the 1970s. In 1979, somebody you may have heard of, a woman called Margaret Thatcher, became Prime Minister, and during the 1980s we see the rise of neoliberalism and we see the retreat of radical social work during this period. And since then, social work in Britain has become much narrower and essentially much more dominated by assessment and care management. What I want to now focus on is more recent developments, which what we have seen in the past 10, 15 years is the re-emergence of what I would call the new radicalism. And there are three main factors that have contributed to the growth of the new radicalism. Firstly, there is dissatisfaction with what is sometimes called new public management, managerialism, and neoliberal social work. I don't know if these terms are familiar to you, but essentially what we have seen, not simply in the UK, but I think in many countries, including Japan, including Australia, right across much of the world, is social workers being, the role of social work being very much reduced to care management, of controlling clients, of social work being dominated by budgets, performance indicators, and so on. And as some people say, the heart has gone out of social work. The possibility to spend time working with people, individually and collectively, has gone out of social work. So there's been real dissatisfaction about this that I'll talk about. The second factor has been 2008, the return of crisis, huge increases in poverty, people's lives getting much worse, and social workers feeling we have to do something about this. And thirdly, we have seen the growth particularly since 1999, of new social movements. In Seattle in 1999, the growth of the anti-capitalist movement. We have seen in Hong Kong and elsewhere the growth of the Occupy movement. So people are actually saying, in the words of Seattle, another world is possible. The world is not a commodity, right? Things can be different. We need a different kind of society. So all of these things have fueled the growth of new forms of radicalism in social work. And this is, I want to just say, first of all, about the Social Work Action Network, because some of us had seen this happening, and people were saying, what's happening to social work? This is not how it used to be. So in 2004, in Glasgow in Scotland, we called a meeting entitled, I didn't come into social work for this. Okay? Social work should be much more, I didn't come into social work for this. We wanted a different kind of social work that was not dominated by management or managerialism, that was not dominated by cuts and restrictions. We launched a social work manifesto, we put it online, and within a very short period, more than 2,000 people had signed up to this manifesto. That was 10 years ago. Since then, the Social Work Action Network has had 10 annual conferences. We have grown very much within the UK. We have had campaigns around in defence of asylum seekers, against cuts, and against the scapegoating of social workers. We have built links with other social movements and with the trade unions. But I think very excitingly, and today I think is an example of it, but what we have found is that feeling that social work should be more than this, that we want a different kind of social work, is a global feeling. Right? That there's an anger across the world about how narrow social work has become. So we have the kind of activities that we have been engaged in the UK. This is a demonstration just last month outside a detention centre for asylum seekers in Scotland. So you see there the SWAN banner, the Social Work Action Network banner, and these are the kind of activities that we feel we should be involved in defending asylum seekers and refugees. But what we have also found that this new radicalism in social work is global. And this is, I've never met this young man. His name is Norbert Ferenc. Norbert is a Hungarian social worker. And in the year 2011, the Hungarian government introduced a new law which made homelessness a crime. Okay? And Norbert and his colleagues felt we cannot simply stand by and allow this to happen. This goes against the values of social work. So they organised a demonstration in central Budapest, which you can see on YouTube. And as a result of doing this, Norbert was arrested, and Norbert was threatened with 4 years in prison for demonstrating in support of homeless people. SWAN in the UK and other organisations launched a campaign in defence of Norbert. We had an online petition, we wrote to the ministers of the government and so on. Norbert did not go to prison. Okay, so he still had a community sentence, but he did not go to prison. So in that way the campaign was a success. But what we also found was that Norbert was a member of a group called the New Approach in Hungary, which we had never heard of, right? And the New Approach, and this is their words, this is from their website, the new approach to community work and radical social work is based on the idea of combining workshops and action groups and the renewal of social work codes of ethics. So they do two things. They have workshops where they discuss strategies, ideas, how can we develop new forms of social work, but they also say, as an action group, we are committed to the profession and the public's attention should be drawn to the situation of those excluded. And in a wonderful statement, I think they say, we seek to be a professional community that is not afraid to stand up for those in need. So these Hungarian colleagues were saying that social workers should not simply confine their work to working with individuals, but should look at the bigger picture and have a responsibility to speak out on behalf of those who are excluded and oppressed. So that was Hungary. This is Slovenia in 2011, where as in Hong Kong, social workers were very involved in the Occupy movement. But not only were they involved in the Occupy movement, they also produced a manifesto. I won't read it all out, but they have argued for what they call direct social work. And they say most of us do not want to work we don't want to just work with paper and not with people. We don't want to simply be a supervisor of the poor. We want to be with the people, to listen to people talking, to be part of the history of people. I should say, I'll leave this PowerPoint here so you can look at the detail later, yeah? We want to resist what they call the economization of everyday life and relation between people. We want to challenge the bureaucratization of human relations and work. And above all, they say, we want to be direct, we want to be social. So they're trying to refine the social within social work. So we have Britain, we have Hungary, we have Slovenia, we have Hong Kong, and this is, you may see some familiar faces. They look a little bit older now, but these are people from, this is the conference here in 2010. And since then, I know that since that early conference, many social workers in Hong Kong have been involved in the wider movements, umbrella movement, the movements for democracy. So what we are seeing, which I think is very, very important and very significant, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Hungary, whether it's Slovenia, whether it's in Hong Kong, we are seeing social workers who are saying social work has something to say. We want to be part of the wider movement for social justice. And perhaps the best example just now of this is in Spain. This is an organisation called the Orange Tide in Spain. It's an organisation of Spanish social workers who have said that we cannot simply carry on while we have more than 50% of young people are unemployed, where many people are homeless, are unemployed. Social work has to say something about this. So they have formed this organisation, which is involved in protests and activities along with their clients on the streets, and is drawing the public's attention to the plight of the poor and the unemployed. And they have gained very wide recognition. This is a statement by the General Secretary, Rory Truell, of the International Federation of Social Work. And Rory says, "In my job, I visit many countries around the world and I speak with social workers. One thing I always tell them is look at the Spanish social workers. I highlight Spain and the Orange Tide as the best example of social work-led social action in the world right now. I would like to see the Orange Tide spread to Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and the rest of the world." So we're seeing something which I think is very, very significant. And there's lots of countries that I haven't mentioned. But there's a very good social work action network in Ireland, and in Greece, and in Canada, and in Belgium. So we are seeing the emergence of new forms of social work, which are also about reclaiming the best of our history, the best of our tradition, but also finding new ways of working. And I'm pleased to say that at our Social Work Action Network conference in Glasgow this year, we had speakers from the Orange Tide, as well as speakers from Greece, to make the links between social workers in Britain and social workers in Spain. So, to bring this to a conclusion, what are we saying? What are some of the characteristics of what we call the new social work? And firstly, and I think important, we're saying against the neoliberals, we're saying that good social work should place people before profit. Okay? It should not be dominated by profit. We should start from the needs of people. It's about reclaiming relationship. Okay? Good relationship-based work, good case work can also be radical, can make a difference to people's lives. But by itself, it does not go far enough. We also need to reclaim community work, reclaim community action. This is part of our tradition as a profession. We have lost it, particularly in the UK we have lost it. We need to reclaim this and develop new forms of community development. We have to go beyond the academy. It's not good enough for academics like myself simply to sit in our offices and write journal papers that very few people read. We have to do better than that. We have to make the links between academics and social movements and bring together in forums such as this here today. We have to fight for democracy, and here, even within the state sector in Britain, within statutory social work, there is very, very little democracy. Service users have very little control over social services. So we have to fight for more control by service users and by workers over the kind of services they provide. One really important thing about the Social Work Action Network is that we seek to break down the barriers between workers and service users and campaigners. So at our conferences, we always have service users speaking from the platform, and we believe that any new social work has to fully involve the people who use services. We have to draw on the experience of people with disabilities. We have to draw on the experience of young people. We have to draw on the experience of mental health service users. We cannot have more paternalistic top-down services. And we have to put social justice back at the heart of social work. Too often, social work has been oppressive or narrow. We actually have to say that part of our role as a profession is to challenge poverty, racism, and other forms of oppression. We have to develop new and radical theory for critical practice. And here, our new journal, Critical and Radical Social Work, attempts to bring the best experiences from across the world so that we can make the links. We have had contributions in our journal from Brazil, from Greece, some from Hong Kong, from Japan and other places. And I'm very hopeful that we will have a report for our journal from the conference here in Hong Kong this weekend. But finally, as I say, I think what we are seeing, and today is this weekend's conference, a big step forward, because I think we are seeing the emergence of a global social work movement that fights for the kind of social work that we want to see. And I just want to end with this is from one of our Greek colleagues, Dora Toloni. And they have had a very hard time in Greece. Many social workers in Greece have not been paid for 6 months, for 9 months. In Greece, the distinction between workers and service users has almost disappeared, because the workers are now service users. But Dora says, from their experience in Greece, we need to find ways to express solidarity in real terms with the people who use social work services. We have to challenge the myths and propaganda. We should not accept the argument that people on benefits or people with disabilities are somehow to blame for a global crisis of capitalism. We should reject the argument that immigrants and asylum seekers are to blame for unemployment. We have to challenge these ideas and these myths. As Dora says, the struggle against austerity is part of a wider struggle against for social change. One feature of neoliberalism is it atomizes people, it individualizes them, it makes people feel very alone. We have to find ways through conferences like this, through different activities, to bring people together, to give us a sense of our collective strength. We have to develop new ways of building critical and radical approaches into our daily practice. We have to take social work values and ideas into the social movement, but also learn from them. And finally, in the words of one of the main slogans from the Seattle protests in 1999 was "Another world is possible." It's our view that another social work is possible. And I just want to end, sometimes we become very preoccupied with day-to-day small matters. And I want to end with a quote from an American social worker, Lillian Weld, in 1915. This is 1915, exactly 100 years ago, writing in the US, just as the First World War was breaking out. And she said, in its broadest conceptions, social work is teaching the sanctity of human life and the doctrine of the brotherhood of man. The social workers of our time are dreaming a great dream and seeing a great vision of democracy, of a real brotherhood among men. You can understand the slightly gendered language. But she meant well. War is the doom of all that has taken years to build up. So as early as 1914, 1915, social workers are saying that social work is much, much more than simply individual budgets or fixing small problems. We have a wider vision. I think that's a vision that we should reclaim. Thank you.